sounds great. What I'm going to do with this is a discussion today about the Yolo Bypass, which is potentially could be a really good example of reconciliation ecology in action, or maybe not. It depends on where all this goes. But it's a big issue here in Yolo County, in this area, and I think it's one that has potentially a lot of importance in the future too. Is essentially showing the way how you can use floodplains. And what I'm going to do now is introduce all the speakers at once, and then they'll come up and each for their share. We'll talk for about 5 minutes, giving their perspective on this issue, and they'll start out with a brief introduction to the bypass, so make sure everybody understands what it is. And so what I'm going to do is just first introduce all the speakers, then Robyn Suddeth will do the introductory talk. And so, Robyn is a graduate student in hydrologic sciences who is just finishing her dissertation on the bypass, and I thought she was a perfect person to introduce this session because her dissertation deals with everything Yolo bypass, on how to make everything fit together. So she'll provide this really good introduction in very brief, 10 minutes, right? What the bypass is all about. She'll be followed by Robyn Kulakow, who is, I want to say, a legend in Yolo County, legend in this region. I've known her for a long time, and has more than a little responsibility for the fact we have water in Petrea Creek and the fact that we have the Yolo Bypass wildlife area. She's the executive director of the Yolo Basin Wildlife Foundation, or Yolo Basin Foundation, sorry. I don't want to say that. Anyway, and very active in all things in what's going on in the Yolo Bypass and elsewhere in this region. So it's great to have her on the table. She'll be followed by Petrea Marchand, who's the executive director of the Yolo Natural Heritage Program, which she's also a private consultant. But the Yolo Natural Heritage Program is really a very special program because it's gotten about $1.7 million in funding in the last few months to really do a bang-up job with figuring out how to conserve critters in Yolo County, and the Yolo Bypass figures into this. She represents Yolo County on a lot of the negotiations taking place around the bypass. Richard Howitt on the end is Professor Emeritus of Agricultural and Resource Economics. He publishes widely on agricultural and environmental resource allocation issues, especially interested in agriculture. And he's done some work on the Yolo Bypass that really goes a long way to help you understand the role of agriculture in the bypass from an economic perspective. Then Bill Fleenor in the blue is a senior researcher at the Center for Watershed Sciences. He's a professional research engineer with the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, where he supervises the environmental dynamics laboratory in civil engineering. He's really an amazing guy to work with. He makes water go where it should. Figures all that out. So he's been working on the bypass water issues, among other things. I think it's a great panel. And finally, Carson Jeffres is a senior researcher at the Center for Watershed Sciences. He's our token fish biologist on the panel. We had to have somebody to defend the fish. And he's a senior researcher, as I mentioned, a senior researcher. His major interest is how juvenile salmonids utilize and benefit from restored habitats. And he has projects, major projects on the Yolo Bypass about raising salmon. So we'll start out then with Robyn and go from there. Thanks, Robyn.
Yeah. Okay, so just so I have kind of a feel of general knowledge in the room, how many of you know where the Yolo Bypass is, have heard of it? Great. Everybody here heard of BDCP, Bay Delta Conservation Plan? Now we're about half. Okay. So you guys all raised your hands, so these maps won't be that much of a surprise to you. The Yolo Bypass is right next to Davis, and it actually is 40 miles long and is a part in our current society of a very large bypass system that is for the Sacramento River watershed. And it serves, its primary purpose to us as a society is to serve as flood control. It can hold about 4 times the flow of the Sacramento River when the Sacramento River is really high. It saved the city of Sacramento from flooding about 7 times, I think, maybe 8 times by now in the last century. So you can see it in this, gotta remember I have this mic. You can see it in this map here at the bottom of this extensive bypass flood control system. But it also sits, thanks to Allison who's in the audience here, I have this map over here which shows what the landscape looked like pre-development in this area. So the bypass sits on what was the historical floodplain for the Sacramento River when it flooded much more often than it does today. So the bypass today floods 1 in every 2 or 3 years, kind of depending on if we're in a wet year cycle or a dry year cycle. And it used to flood almost annually. And the types of flooding that the bypass would receive were also much more varied than they are today. Today the bypass only floods, well, except for the west side tributaries, but from the Sacramento River, it only floods kind of majorly when the Sacramento River is really high. You don't get the same variety in small to large floods that you once would have had in the more natural system. The more natural system also looked very different in terms of the vegetation and topography. It was much more heterogeneous in terms of it had riparian forests, seasonal wetland, permanent floodplain lakes that no longer exist, a much more dendritic channel structure towards the bottom, towards where it ran into the delta. And you can see now most of the bypass is agricultural. There's also still a lot of wetland that is heavily managed today, so it looks very different from what wetland would have looked like 100 years ago. But there is some purposeful lands out there for waterfowl and shorebirds and lots of other critters that Robyn will talk in more detail about when she speaks. So that's kind of a very brief overview of what it was and what it is today. I'll go into some more detail in a bit. So why are we talking about the Yolo Bypass? Why is it so important? Well, its location, it's right at the intersection between Sacramento River and the delta. It serves as the lowest floodplain in the Sacramento River system before the river empties out into the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So that's an important place for a lot of fish species, and it's also important in terms of its location along the Pacific Flyway for migrating waterfowl and other bird species in the wintertime. So it's locationally important for them. It's also locationally important for us in terms of residents of Sacramento and the surrounding areas, as I mentioned before, for flood control. It's important right now politically because it's a big player in the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. About half of you rose your hands when I asked about that. So that's a plan that's attempting to figure out ways to mitigate for some of the damage that's been done with the Delta ecosystems in terms of the way that water is being pumped to Southern California for urban and agricultural uses. And there's a lot of different habitat mitigation components to that really, really big plan. But one of the major ones is restoring fish habitat on the Yolo Bypass. And it's gotten a lot of attention, and it's something that a lot of these panel members can talk about as well. So it's in the current kind of news cycle and eyes of policymakers. It's important because it has many different uses, some of which I've already touched on. So, it's important as a waterfowl wintering habitat, but also for recreational users that go out there and hunt waterfowl, or they go out there just to look at the birds and take pictures of them and enjoy the landscape. And then there are uses for fish and birds and also for other critters that I haven't mentioned yet that don't get as much playtime. So Swainson hawk is a really big one, the giant garter snake. And then in terms of fish species, there's I think Peter talked about this a while ago. We haven't revisited it for a while, but that Delta smelt could benefit from some types of habitat restoration in the very bottom portions of the bypass. So there's a lot of different stakeholders, both human and ecological, that could benefit from this particular landscape. Which brings us to sort of the most important point and what Peter talked about earlier, that this is a great case study for the idea of reconciliation. There are so many different fish and bird and other species that can depend and do depend on this system, and it's in this very heavily modified, human-engineered landscape. And the fact is that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the bypass is already somewhat functioning for all of these different fish and bird species while still being an agricultural landscape and still functioning for flood control and all the other human uses that I've talked about. So I think the question is, can we do a better job of that? Can we make it better for these species that we know already get some positive use out of it and depend upon it? So I wanted to go over some of the things that we sort of already know that the science has already told us about the bypass. All of these figures right here are from the Central Valley Joint Venture, which is the plan to manage all the areas in the Central Valley that these wintering waterfowl and other bird species depend upon as they make their migrations south and north along the Pacific Flyway. So you can see that of the Yolo Basin, which is one of 7 basins in the Central Valley joint venture, something like that, the bypass is really the major, I mean, it's it. There's a little bit of habitat outside of the bypass, but the bypass is a major player in the Yolo Basin. And they've learned a lot about, when the birds are there, when the densities of those populations are highest, and when the food supplies are high in those. So you can see on this graphic right here, the blue, I keep forgetting about my mic. The blue here is the energy demand from the birds, and the red is the supply. But what this graphic is showing is only the supplies that are available if you don't count agricultural uses. So one of the things that comes out of this graphic, and it's talked about a little bit in the waterfowl literature, is that rice and other agricultural crops are actually important players as food sources for these birds. There's also been a lot of research in the aquatic ecosystem side of things. These graphs here, the top one is the one that I wanted to bring your attention to. They compare the dark bars are chlorophyll A concentrations in the Yolo Bypass when it's flooding compared to the main stem Sacramento River. This was researched by, who was it, Lehman et al. In 2007. So you can see primary productivity is much higher in the bypass when it's flooding than it is in the river itself. And this leads to good things for fish. So Chinook salmon take advantage of this as they migrate through the bypass. They can have much higher growth rates there than they do in the main stem river. That's something also that Carson is finding out now on rice fields in the bypass, which wasn't looked at in these previous studies specifically. And then split tail also come up onto the bypass to rear. So, and they use it as spawning grounds. So it's already kind of, like I said before, been shown to be valuable for these bird and fish species, even as it is today. I wanted to give you guys kind of a brief understanding of the political realities of where the bypass is right now. So this is a table that summarizes what the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is proposing way far down the line. So this is if they had, the bypass is overflowed when the Sacramento River overflows a weir at the top called the Fremont Weir. So what the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is proposing is to put a notch in that weir so that more water can come in when the river is lower than it can currently come in. So the idea is to increase the frequency of flooding at different times of the year by quite a lot in some parts. So you can see for March 1st through 23rd, currently 47% of years have weir overflow, and if they were able to notch it and engineer the system in this way, that would increase to 72 to 81% of years where water would be available during that time period. They're talking about up to 6,000 CFS and 7 to 10,000, up to actually 17,000 acres of added extent of flooding than what is currently seen during certain time periods. And the bottom here kind of talks about which fish species they are targeting. And that's about as detailed as the BDCP gets right now. There isn't a lot of sort of nuanced detail about how they would manage those flows, where it would go, all the sort of moment-to-moment decision-making that would be involved in such a plan. So there's a lot of perceived conflict with a plan like this, with the idea of adding more fish habitat on the bypass. And all of these graphs come from, well, most of them except for this one right here, which comes from Richard Howitt's agricultural economics study that he'll talk about. All of these graphs up here come from expert surveys. So I interviewed a lot of fish biologists and waterfowl and bird ecologists about what those species want in terms of being the availability and type of habitat that they prefer when they're using the Yolo Bypass, or just in general for floodplains in the system. And so you can see here there's some conflicts in terms of timing, and that's because the bird and fish species, so this is just for dabbling ducks and for juvenile salmon. I also asked about splittail and shorebirds. But for these two species, they'd like, habitat is valuable for them all the way through March. And the fact is that there are some agricultural uses, like this is a little bit blurry for you guys, sorry, but that's a safflower. And you can see that even in February up until March, if the plant date is delayed past March, which means their growing season is limited to, shorter than it otherwise would be, they start seeing losses in yield. So, if you're not able to plant as early as you'd like, the amount of crop that you get back in the end of the growing season is less. And so because of these losses in yield, there's losses in revenues and then in profits for these farmers. So there's that perceived conflict in terms of timing. There's also another nuance in terms of wetland management, which is that, sure, the birds might use it in April and May when they come in, and shorebirds especially like some habitat later in the year. But wetland managers are also farmers in the sense that they want to grow the right type of plant for food supply for the birds the following fall. And if there's water for too long on those landscapes or on those wetland units, then they also face the prospect of those food supplies not being what they otherwise could be. So it's a very sort of balanced system. Minute left. Oh, I thought I had it down. So the other, I guess, Carson, I can talk longer than I thought I could. The other conflict that I've shown here is the conflict between depths. So you can see that fish, very simply, want deeper water, and waterfowl tend to do better in shallower water, especially when we're talking about foraging habitat for birds. So I'm going to actually, since I only have a minute left, kind of skip. So there's a lot of research being done, and you're going to hear about it because all of these people are here to talk about it today. You know, Richard has done a lot of work trying to understand in more detail how agriculture will be affected by delayed plant dates, like I was talking about. Petrea has helped Richard with that work and done a lot of that herself, and she can talk a lot also about the effects of any of these things on the county of Yolo County itself. They have, you know, tax revenues that they're concerned about. And Carson can talk about the fish and the bugs, and Richard can talk about hydrology, and Robyn can talk about waterfowl management and some other things in the Yolo Bypass management area. So I'm going to skip over all of that and just get to this final question, and this is a lot up here. I'm just going to read through these because I thought it'd be interesting to see what everybody here had to say to some of them. So the one at the top is what Peter sent out, I think, to everyone, which is, can the Yolo Bypass be managed as a reconciled ecosystem, and if so, what are the factors that make it possible, difficult, or impossible to achieve this? And are the perceived tensions among farmers, fishery managers, flood managers, wildlife managers, and other interests resolvable? And so I added a couple here. What can be done right away? Can land use be even better integrated today than it is already? And then there's kind of this longer term question. If water does become available by something like a notched weir, how would you optimally manage that water in a little more detail than what's currently been talked about in BDCP? And are there ways to engineer improvements that further better the system? You know, once you have the water in there, maybe you'd want to control it with inflatable dams. And there's some of those kind of things that Bill can talk about in terms of the hydraulic or hydrologic modeling. And then finally, there's kind of the political questions. You know, if you wanted to convert some of the agricultural land uses out there to, say, wetland for habitat, how would you do that? How would you incentivize farmers to do that? How would you, make sure that there aren't huge losses to the human uses of the system and that there's a proper management in place to manage such wetlands and things like that? So these are, some of the kind of longer term questions that I think we need to think about. So I'm out of time.
We're going to have lots of time for questions at the end. So, Robyn and Kulakow, if you give us your opinion for a few minutes.
Okay. Well, my opinion on the question you asked in the email about is
Turn it off.
yeah. Okay. The question that I can give an answer to is whether restoration ecology can work in the Yolo Bypass, and I can talk about the perceived conflicts. So my point is that restoration ecology is already going on in the Yolo Bypass. I work on behalf of the 16,800 acre Yolo Bypass wildlife area. That restoration of that area began in 1994, but before that, it was a local effort created the wildlife area. It's not that it was the idea of the government and they plopped it down there. It was the local community felt that it was the right place to restore wetlands. In those days, people did talk about restoring waterfowl habitat, but the management there has evolved to the point where we're managing very diverse wetland ecosystems. So at this point, and the management changes every year. The habitat that was once that was put in '94 has been modified at least several times as people learn more about managing for wetland species. So the bypass is about close to 69,000 acres. The wildlife area is maybe almost 20% of the bypass. At the wildlife area, we are successfully balancing flood control, agriculture, management of diverse wetland ecosystems, public use. There's hunting. We run a large environmental education program. There's probably 30,000 birders that use it every year. There are hunters, tens of thousands of hunters that use it. It's a very beloved, heavily used place that's still managing to be a productive ecosystem. So we've been working with all the different interests that Robyn mentioned since the early 90s. And in the 1997, we created a group called the Yolo Bypass Working Group. And that group has been meeting continuously since 1997. We invite all the different interests that Robyn talked about. So you've got the wetland managers. Many of them are owners of private hunting clubs. There's the managers of the public property. There are Department of Water Resources, flood control engineers, and ecologists. There are the fisheries biologists, fisheries managers. There's all the regulatory agencies. There's the Mosquito District, Sacramento, Yolo, Mosquito and Vector Control District. On top of that, now we're dealing with the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board because of worries about methylation of mercury in wetlands and rice fields. So this place is also a huge research resource. So, and the agriculture supports 50% of the state budget for management of the wildlife area, in addition to providing very valuable habitat. And you've all seen that as you drive over the causeway towards Sacramento. The birds there are feeding in rice fields. Okay, so my point is that once BDCP, the current programmatic plan is approved, there's going to be the Yolo Bypass Fish Enhancement Plan. All the local interests will be represented there, and I feel that we can come up with a plan that meets the needs of the fish, the adults and the young fish, and that's my point. So once we have this detailed fish management plan, it's really important that a governance structure is created as a result of the planning process, so that all the interests are represented into the future, because the ecosystem's going to be changing and there are all these diverse needs. And if you're going to create such, a 60,000 acre working landscape, that's to be successful, we're going to need all the people working together for the long term. And I think really the only conflict left at this point, and Petrea will talk about that, is with the regulatory agencies.
Right. 5 minutes.
I'm going to stand up so everybody can see me. So my name is Petrea Marchand, and I am with, I do own my own consulting firm, so I think a little additional background about who I represent will be helpful to understand my perspective that's going to underlie the basis of this talk. So first of all, I am the executive director of the Yolo Natural Heritage Program, and that is a joint powers agency that is composed of 4 cities and the county of Yolo, so Woodland, Winters, West Sacramento, Davis, and then the county of Yolo. And the purpose of that JPA is to develop a countywide conservation plan to protect 11 endangered and threatened species, including the giant garter snake and the Swainson's hawk, which Robyn talked about. So those species are present in the bypass, so that'll factor into my conversation. Separately, I also represent the Yolo County Board of Supervisors, which are the elected officials that govern the county of Yolo, in the negotiations on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, specifically on this Bay Delta Conservation Plan's proposed project to notch the Fremont Weir, as Robyn described, and add additional water for fish habitat. So I represent both of those entities. So I have I dabble a little bit with terrestrial species and a little bit with fish species, but not necessarily on the same side as all of the fish biologists in the room. So I come at it from a local perspective. I just want to make that clear to the audience that that is my background, that is my professional experience. And I also come at this from an interdisciplinary perspective. My educational training is in interdisciplinary problem solving. So I really believe in bringing together economics, biology, law, science to solve problems today. I don't think it's all about what's best for the fish or what's best for the hawk. It's about integrating all those together. So that's really how I approach this conversation about the Yolo Bypass, and in particular the question about reconciliation ecology and what factors make it possible and what factors make it difficult. So factors that make it difficult, I'll just start off with the tough stuff. From my perspective, one of the most difficult things is what the previous speakers have already described. We have amazing land uses already exist in the Yolo Bypass. So first, I agree with Robyn that I think we already have reconciliation ecology in the bypass. And the question now is not, do we have it? The question is, can we add to it and add fish to the species that currently benefit from the bypass habitat? And that's really, I think, the focus of some of these additional conversations. But I think it's very important. Dr. Moyle called Robyn a legend, and I think that's true. It's her efforts and efforts of people like her in the community that have made the bypass the place that it is today, and supporting the number of species that it does today. And I think that's really important to recognize that we're talking about adding something else onto an already existing structure. And the existing structure, including the agriculture in the bypass, also provides different species benefits. So the rice provides giant garter snake habitat, the rice provides waterfowl habitat. All of these uses are integrated in a really special way that's been nationally recognized. So I think that makes it difficult because there's people who have worked hard to create the reconciled bypass landscape that we have today, and those people are going to fight to keep it that way. That's just the way people are. That's the way we operate in this society. So I think that's going to make it difficult to add the fish habitat on top of the existing uses of the bypass. The second factor I think makes it difficult is scientific uncertainty, and this is probably something that you guys confront on a regular basis in your studies. So it's both the scientific uncertainty and this is equally important, the unwillingness to admit when it's uncertain. It's everyone in the scientific community or in the policy community especially, I'd say probably less so in the scientific community than in the world that I work in, which is in state and federal government. Everyone wants to be able to go into a meeting and say, this is the way it is. Fish need this, hawk needs this, and less people are willing to say, you know what, I think they need this, but this is the additional work that we need to do to further understand it, and maybe this is the approach we need to take in the face of all of that uncertainty. Because ultimately, a lot of these regulatory agencies, which is the point I'm going to end on, need to make really difficult decisions in real time that rely on imperfect science. And so since they have to make those real decisions based on imperfect science, there's a tendency to overestimate or to overemphasize how certain that science actually is. And so that's one of the major challenges. So the last really difficult factor, I think, for reconciliation ecology is the regulatory agencies themselves. I don't know, can anybody raise their hand? Anybody here already work for a regulatory agency, National Marine Fisheries Service, Department of Fish and Wildlife, or interested in working for them at some point? Okay, just a couple, so I can say whatever I want. So for understandable reasons, some of the things that Robyn referred to, there's been a lot of damage that's been done to the environmental landscape as a result of human actions over the last 150 years in California. So it's natural for regulatory agency biologists to want to ask for as much as they possibly can in programs like the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which is ultimately a permit from these wildlife agencies. And if they can't get it, if that desire to get whatever they can in a situation like this where they have the regulatory authority limits the amount of flexibility that you have to reach a compromise among all these existing uses in the Yolo Bypass. And so unless staff in the wildlife agencies are willing to say, yes, we are willing to embrace flexibility, we are willing to understand that maybe we have to flood until March and not until May, it's going to be very difficult to achieve reconciliation ecology or to add another use. So I'll just end with why I think it's possible, because I do think it's possible. Probably the best evidence is that Robyn's done it, right? That the people in the bypass, the people in the county have done it already. So I think it is possible to add another use into the bypass. One of the factors that makes it possible is to create additional benefits for the uses that are in the bypass, do some things for the wildlife area that make it work better, do some things for the farmers to help the water drain better off their fields, or to supply, to improve the infrastructure through which they supply water to their fields. Consider those needs at the same time that you're considering the biological needs of fish. So that's where I'll end.
Okay, Richard. Richard Howitt, economics.
Economics, yeah. As a representative of what's often called the dismal science, I'm going to break with tradition and be optimistic. It's going to work, guys. It's going to work. Remember, reconciliation ecology is working landscapes. Why are they working landscapes? Because they produce economic benefits and work for the big predator, us. And we have to understand, if you're an ecologist who's concerned with working landscapes, which of course, if you're not, you cut out a large proportion of the world, and you can go to the deep rainforests and have fun. But if you really want to influence the world, you're going to have to work with working landscapes. And so when Robyn was talking about the ducks in the bypass, did you notice the duck economics she put up there? Did you notice the energy function of the demand for energy and the supply of energy, and how they crossed, and how later in the year the natural energy was not sufficient to support the Pacific flyway, and they needed to get their energy from some other place? The ducks are concerned with kilocalories, as are, of course, Swainson hawks and other species. But there's another predator in this working ecology, and it's called people. And in this particular case, it's farmers. And if the farmers have the right ecological incentives, which is money, they will plant rice, and the rice will generate the energy for the ducks. Why is this going to work here? Because we have a fantastic serendipitous situation. I think it's serendipitous. Carson will explain it to you. Where in fact, not only do ducks like rice, but fish like rice too. And this was an absolute eye-opener for me, that because of a nice intervening species, which Carson will tell you about, fish like rice. And so what we have is, if you provide the correct incentives for the big predator in the system, they will provide open space for flood control. Remember, it's primarily flood control, and that's where the big dollars are. So the last thing you want is one of these reversion to natural habitat of cottonwoods and other things, because that would completely undermine the central purpose of the floodplain, the Yolo Bypass, which is flood control. There's a second economic sense, and that is farming. Now, it turns out that farmers work to give you self-financing open space for flood control. And then, if we're lucky, and what we're trying to do is, we've already got the bird relationship, and now we're trying to build the fish relationship on it. But the beauty and why it's going to work, despite, and I know minimize the problems that Petrea is dealing with reluctantly moving regulators. But we've got to be looking at this as a complete working ecology with a bunch of species in there. And if we can find that sweet spot of interdependence between the species that doesn't trash one species ecologist, so we're not trashing the farmers, we're not trashing the duck hunters, we're not trashing the ducks, and we're not trashing the salmon, then we have what ecologists, economists would call a Pareto optimal, and we've got those trade-offs. But I would encourage you to think of the trade-off functions for all those species, and Robyn has some really interesting stuff in her dissertation about the trade-off between, of course, ducks and fish for water depth. And we've got timing and fish for farming. So I think it's fascinating. I think it's the future of the majority of ecology. And I think in this case, certainly, despite the problems, it's going to work. Thank you.
Okay, Good afternoon. I'm Bill Fleenor, and I'm an engineer. You can always tell the people that are in 12-step programs by their laughter, so I caught a few here today already.
12 steps.
The engineering is very simply the application of scientific and economic principles to the solution of societal needs and mores. And so from an pure engineering standpoint, I mean, this is a simple problem. Every engineering thing is a simple problem because people come to you and say, here are the economic constraints, here are the political constraints, here are the environmental constraints. And so you take that, and we have this beautiful landscape on which to solve these types of problems. Now, do we know the answer a priori? No, it takes quite a bit of work. Now, the bypass, as you heard today, was originally a very natural bypass type of system. Of course, with hydraulic mining and the filling up of sediment, we caused it to flood in different ways and other types of things. And so we eventually created it as an unnatural bypass system, right? And by that, we built the Fremont Weir. And as you heard, one of the things the BDCP wants to do is notch that weir to get water into it more often. Some people may not know it, but the weir was originally built with a notch. And then we went in and filled it in all up to the same level because we didn't like how often it flooded. We weren't giving due consideration to things other than what we personally wanted to do. And some of that, had to do with agriculture. And agricultural is very important. I don't know, Petrea could probably tell you, but the bypass accounts for quite a bit of Yolo County Yolo County agricultural income. And in really dry years, parts of Yolo County are high and away from water, but the bypass can nearly always be farmed reasonably because of its lower and its proximity to water. So it becomes even more valuable at that time. So our goal, now the reason the notch was done away with before is one reason is because the water was coming on, but it wasn't giving us the types of benefits that we were really after, because we found that we were stranding a lot of fish, and we still do strand a lot of fish. When we have a pretty good flood, you'll even see DWR assign people out there in boats, and they'll try to capture particularly some of the bigger sturgeon who are endangered and return them to the channels. So trapping fish in that manner is not a good thing ecologically. So we have to find ways to get the water on and off. Agriculture needs water off so they can maximize their income, their profits, their produce. We don't like to pay more at the store either. And of course, we need certain depths and durations for the benefit of fish and fowl. So it's a combination of those things that is our chore then to go out and see what we can find and do, and keep it flexible enough, because we don't expect everybody's science to be 100% correct up front, including our own as hydraulic modelers. We expect to have a certain amount of error in there as well. We certainly don't want it to go back to 1850s, because it wouldn't even be the floodway that it was today. So in that respect, what we're trying to do, what we're examining, we have some students sitting in here. Layla, of course, Robyn has done some of this work herself as well. What we want to do is look at simple dams for the tow drain. There's a drain on the east side that's continuous all the way down to the Sacramento River, catches Cache Creek and then Cache Slough, and then all the way down to the river. And by putting in some simple bladder dams, which are fairly inexpensive, fairly easy to put in, quite controllable, we can see what kind of water we can get on different parts of the land and get off, and thereby benefiting fish and fowl and not doing too much damage to agriculture. And so we can do these examinations with a hydraulic model pretty cheaply, especially, thank you, basically compared to what it would take to put in something and then take it out. So we can play these little what-if scenarios and get these things, get a fairly decent handle on these things while while scientists, fish people and bird people and others managing it, like Robyn, can also figure out what is the best way to get these things accomplished. So it's an optimization problem that's of a very large magnitude, and we can solve it. There's no question we can solve it, but the question is, what's the best solution for the minimum amount of money and the best outcome, which is what society is looking for. Society being you and I who are paying taxes. So I think that's my story.
And lastly, it boils down to the fish. So I actually think that the Yolo Bypass is a great example of restoration ecology. And I'll start with a little history and kind of how we got to where the work that we're doing now began. And so Ted Summer, who was not here, who was supposed to be one of the other fish people up here and not leave me as the sole fish person, was finding that during those wet flood years when the Yolo Bypass would flood naturally, fish that were leaving the bypass were larger than fish that were just going down the river channel. And so that ended up in this big cascade of research that's happened over the last 15 years, not only on the Yolo Bypass, but more natural systems like the Cosumnes River down south of Sacramento, where a bunch of work went into looking at what made a floodplain beneficial for salmon. What was the food web that happened? And what were the physical processes that ultimately led to fish growing faster on a floodplain than in the river? And so with a bunch of people working down there, we went back and started looking at the Yolo Bypass, knowing what we learned on that natural system, and looking if we could essentially mimic those processes on a managed system, like rice fields, for instance, on the Yolo Bypass. A rice field is a wetland in some sense, but it's not a floodplain. We use it as a flood bypass on the Yolo Bypass, but when you think of what a salmon habitat during its outmigration should look like, a rice field isn't the first thing that comes to mind. And part of that is that the floodplain doesn't, or the Yolo Bypass doesn't always flood in coordination, or at least reach a high enough magnitude to flood on every year at the right time for fish. And so if you want to manage for a threatened species like Chinook salmon in the Central Valley, is that you need water out there most years at the time that coordinates with their life history. And so we were thinking about how can we do this, and we saw essentially a bunch of rice fields on the bypass. And so we did something as simple on the first year as going out and literally just throwing juvenile salmon into a little rice field, a 5-acre field, and we wanted to see how they grew and compare that to what some of the other data that we had seen. And we found that those fish grew faster than any other observed growth rates in the Central Valley, either river or floodplain. And so we started asking the questions, what is it about a rice field that makes it interesting and makes it a good habitat? And so again, through another large group of people that involved the Department of Water Resources, Fish and Game, UC Davis, private landowners and the farmers out there, we went out and started actually asking those questions. What are the actual processes that we know happen on a natural floodplain? And can we essentially mimic those on the habitats that exist on the Yolo Bypass? So we looked at fallow fields, disc fields, standing rice stubble, and Nick is over here, who's our zooplankton man. It turned out that that's the key to making the floodplain happen, is that you have to have a robust food source in conditions that are conducive to growth. And so one of the things that we found is that actually disked rice fields turn out to be the fastest growing salmon habitat on the bypass, which, essentially a muddy substrate that had just been tilled, we put water on it, and it's the fastest growing salmon that we've seen in the Central Valley. And that's just very counterintuitive for what we think as ecologists, particularly restoration ecologists, because you think of happy fields with bunnies going through them, and then it floods up and salmon go out and they live this great existence and then they wash out with the river. But we're looking at plain dirt that was farmed the year before, tilled under, it was flooded up like they would under natural farming conditions. And that's what the farmers like to do to help decompose their rice. And so we ended up in this situation where our best growing habitat was also the best farming habitat. And really, Petrea had it nailed in that the flexibility is the thing that's currently missing right now, particularly between wet years, dry years, and having hard dates on management for a species and a climate that doesn't have hard dates on it. During dry years, there's no way you could keep fish in a habitat that's flooded late into the season because it's too warm. During wet years, if it's wet anyway, there's no way that they can start their farming. And so having that flexibility built into this reconciled ecosystem and agrosystem is really where we find the benefit from having agriculture management and putting those ecological processes and overlaying them on top of each other.
Thank you. Okay. While you're thinking of your questions, let me quick get the conversation started by asking everybody a question, which is, if you could put a restriction, built to assume that the weir is going to be built there, or the notch of the weir is going to be built, what kind of rules or operating rules or restrictions would you put on that notch? Okay, whatever you want. So Robyn Suddeth, you want to start out? Let's go down the panel. 30-second
restrictions on the notch. I mean, well, I would say I would kind of mirror what Carson just said, which is that it depends on the year and the timing that the water is available. So the time of year that the river would be high enough to actually have water come through that notch will vary from year to year. And I think that you'd have to have some governmental structure set up, like Robyn said, that kind of goes through some of the different scenarios and the different possible years that might occur, and have an agreement there already set up between the farmers and the different users on the bypass to know, in this type of year, we'll allow water to come through at this time for this long, and have an idea of how you would manage those flows. And same for, a dry year versus a wet year. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I agree with Robyn. Really, the point of conflict is March, early March. And the farmers, if they're going to optimize their yields, they need the flooding to stop, because it will take beginning of March, because they need the fields, the bypass needs to drain, and then the heavy clay soils have to be, they have to dry out enough to be plowed. The same goes for managed wetlands. You need to be able to start drawing down the water in early March so that the nutritious wetland plants that the birds rely on when they show up in large numbers in the fall and winter, they need to germinate in the early spring. If you wait till the later you wait, the more weed species come in, and the less nutritious the wetland plants are.
Well, once again, I'm an engineer, so it's all about control. And so it's a matter of whether we can control that, but still find ways to not entrap the fish, not impound the fish, and also to find ways to get the fish through passage. I think through passage is also a key element to this. And so there are some questions in that regard that we do not have final answers.
Yeah, and particularly, I've been speaking about juvenile salmon. I'll also preface that I've been talking about one life history of one species, and it's obviously more complicated than that. There's the passage issue for upstream adults, and both winter run Chinook, spring run Chinook, and green and white sturgeon both have those happening. But back to the actual question. I think it goes along with exactly what I just said earlier, is that dry years, you can't have fish out there anyway. And wet years if you have a really wet March, you're not going to be able to disc it anyway and work the ground. If you have a flooding in March, then it's going to be good habitat. And so you have to be able to work within that environmental framework and climate conditions.
I agree with Carson, but I'd be a little bit more definitive in the beginning because we don't know so much. And so I would limit it to 4,000 acres. I would end flooding March 1st, unless there's some of these conditions that Carson was talking about. And I would implement an aggressive adaptive management program that relies heavily on research from UC Davis.
Well, don't have much to add. March 15, wet years. Extend the natural flooding by a couple of weeks or more, and have a simple, non-governmental organized rule that people can rely on. Just March 15, wet years, that's it. And that's we've got lots of work to do, but it's probably about the best trade-off.
So, questions from the audience? Yeah.
There's one thing we've been avoiding, and I think it's the biggest problem we've got out there is mosquito bait.
I agree. So anybody want to respond to that? It is a good row in the corner that we did not get lucky getting somebody here to talk about that. So.
Well, I can talk about it. I was just told in these types of talks, don't talk about mosquitoes because people just roll their eyes. But really, the most powerful agency out in the bypass is the Mosquito District because they can tell you to drain. And you have to, and they can tell you you can't flood up till November 1st because of mosquito, depending on the conditions, the weather conditions of that year, they can tell you just wait till or November 1st, and you've missed a large part of the migratory bird season. So, but March around having flooding stop sometime in March fits the needs of the Mosquito District also because they need the ponds to start drying down as the weather warms up, and they don't like to have a lot of the weedy vegetation that sprouts with later flooding.
So Carson, can't those fish just eat all those mosquitoes?
I know, we just need more fish. That's a simple solution.
Anybody else want to comment on mosquitoes? It is a major issue because obviously nobody wants to come down with any of these diseases that they're spreading. Yeah.
So state legislation, specifically the Central Valley Flood Protection Act of 2008, has directed the state and regional entities to make significant improvements to the state plan of flood control, so the flood system. In that legislation, the state was directed to make improvements to river geomorphology, different habitat types, floodplain, riparian, and also stabilize or increase populations of species throughout the system. And so I'm curious how you see some of those initiatives being integrated into the bypass, given the fact that it's one of the more significant flood control facilities in the Central Valley. And also, given the, well, I'll leave my question there.
So you're asking basically, how does Yolo Bypass fit into the enhanced, I want to say flood management efforts of the agencies?
Exactly. How do those initiatives fit into what is being discussed today?
I'll take that one.
Okay.
So in my role of working for the Yolo County Board of Supervisors, I'm also involved in the implementation of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, which is what came out of the act that he just discussed. And one of the major proposals is expansion of the Yolo Bypass, because the Yolo Bypass is the cornerstone of the Sacramento River flood control project system, and they can't fix the other parts of the flood control system until they expand the capacity of the Yolo Bypass. So that is an ongoing effort, and the integration that's proposed is actually a very complicated one because the agencies that I referred to earlier, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fishery Service, Bureau of Reclamation, all the state and federal agencies that are involved, have to decide now whether or not they're going to notch the Fremont Weir and flood in the areas that Robyn Suddeth and all of us have been talking about for the last hour, or are they going to wait and integrate that enhanced floodplain habitat into the expanded Yolo Bypass? And there is a timing issue there. Regardless, you're absolutely correct. The Central Valley Flood Protection Act does require all new flood protection projects to be multi-benefit. So there's also some potential for there to be two separate fish projects that happen in the Yolo Bypass. One that's done in the quote-unquote near term, next 10 to 15 years, in the location that we discussed, and another one that's done in the next 20 to 30 years in the location of the expanded Yolo Bypass. So that is, to my knowledge, is the discussions that are occurring around integration. But if this issue wasn't already complicated enough, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is adding to it.
I just like it. So the important thing is to have everybody talking to each other. And I went to hundreds of hours of meetings in which the flood agencies were not even aware of what was happening with the BDCP. they finally have interagency discussions. You know, Department of Water Resources flood control was going this way, and Department of Water Resources Ecological Services was going this way. Now they realize that every once in a while they have to come together and talk about this. But that was a long time coming.
Other questions? Yeah.
Is there any more direction into trying to expand the experimentation with fish in the agricultural areas of the bypass? I'll probably take that one.
Yes. I don't know if we're expanding spatially at this point. We're still understanding. I mean, it seems like every year is something that we didn't expect to have happen, particularly, like last year was looking at the disc fields as being the most productive habitat and understanding why that is. And then because we tried to run our experiment so long last year, which isn't a good thing in a dry year, we had predation issues. And how do you understand the predation issues? And so we still are we know that those habitats are good at certain times of year, but how do we integrate them into the system? Like, we're still at that phase of looking at 18 acres and we have replicated fields, so we have different treatments, and we're still at that level of asking questions and doing research.
Interesting. Been fortunate that it hasn't flooded.
Yeah, because if it floods, then all our fish get washed out. And so really though, when it floods, everything is good because you're getting fish washed out from the Sacramento, naturally. But what we're looking at are those years when it doesn't flood during the right time of year and managing for that period of year when it's dry. And otherwise they wouldn't be wet and there wouldn't be fish on there. And so we're looking at that drier year scenario with our research.
And on the larger scale, how would you get fish back out? What would the plan be?
Getting fish onto the bypass?
Mm-hmm.
That
On a
would
larger
be
scale,
that would be
right.
through the notch. Some sort of conveyance structure that,
That's actually
a notch, a tubes, whatever it is, they would have to come from during that bringing of water from the Sacramento out onto the bypass.
build it and they will come scenario.
Actually, I mean, if I was going to give my perspective earlier on one of the difficulties, that seems to be one of the biggest difficulties in terms of reconciling, better habitat for fish on the bypass because, that's all right. Because it doesn't seem that anyone has the direct answer to that question yet of how best to actually attract fish to the bypass. If there was a notch there, there's a lot of debate about whether a good number of fish would even enter the bypass in that scenario. So, I mean, Carson knows a lot more about
I would say that those fish are particles, and essentially they're moving down the outside of the river or down the margins, and that, if you're pulling water off the margin, that they're most likely getting sucked out. I mean, you're talking about fish that are, 40 mils long. Like, we picked up a bunch of fish today from the river that were averaged an inch. And so those fish are not actively seeking habitat. We're getting washed down through a river. So if there's a suck going through whatever structure it is out onto the bypass, they're going to go along with it.
Yeah, I'd like to see research done on extending the naturally occurring flooding that happens, because then the fish are already in the bypass, but we don't have any way of keeping them into the rice fields or the managed wetlands, because usually the boards are pulled.
So we're actually doing that now. If it would only flood, we're set up to test that. We did a little bit last year, but we only had our flood in early December, so very few fish actually came out. And then we really haven't seen a flood since then, since we actually have the infrastructure and to check what we call the flood extension project.
Yes.
Are the fish actually coming down in fairly predictable pulses where you could say, we want them now on dry years and being able to have them, you're diverting water at chunks of time, but do you have a good sense of the timing of those pulses, or is that as ephemeral as the weather?
It's a little bit general. We know the general, probably a few weeks. I know that on the Feather River, their peak migration was hit yesterday. So, they cleaned 65,000 salmon out of each of their traps yesterday. So they hit their peak yesterday, and it's probably going to go down from here.
What's down from here? What's the time span that we're talking about?
A few weeks, they'll trickle out. There's always some stragglers on the end, but, once you hit that, peak of this is probably about the time of year when you'd see it. If you have a flood event or if you have any really sort of flow event prior to that, like I said, they're particles and they're just getting washed down onto wherever they end up.
I just wanted to add to that question that my point about scientific uncertainty, I think, is relevant here as well. I've sat through a number of meetings with the Wildlife Agency as well, where they're trying to build models that demonstrate how many fish would make it onto the bypass through different sizes of notches, because there's a lot of different proposals for how big it should be, how long it should be, how deep it should be. And my impression, and I'm not a scientist, is that there's enough uncertainty that people don't really know how many fish would make it on. And then that's complicated by the fact that the fish they really want on the floodplain, which are the endangered winter run and spring run salmon, are so few in numbers that it makes it even more challenging to figure out how many will actually make it onto the floodplain. So I guess to my point, that's one of those issues that I wish people were just really upfront about. We need to learn a lot more. We need to do a lot of studies after we build the notch to figure out what works, what doesn't.
We do know enough that we know the fact that the notch will have to be located in a less than optimum location. In other words, a more expensive location in order to get optimum use out of it. So it will be one of those additional costs.
Well, to build on that question, are fish hatcheries, are salmon hatcheries, are they being integrated into this program? Why aren't we putting fry into those fields?
I think that is a whole different seminar. We're using hatchery fish right now because using wild fish, we actually put in for our wild fish permit in November and we got it last Thursday. And so we were able to get our 300 wild fish today. So it's, obviously that's part of a bigger management plan. And right now we're just able to use a few wild fish to compare whether there's any difference in the wild fish and the hatchery fish that we're using. As far as using it for grow out ponds for hatcheries or whatever, that's a whole different thing that I don't think, I don't think that we're even gonna touch that today.
That's right, for the fish guys again carrying on this conversation. These fish are naturally built to deal with a highly variable system. Are we looking to try and build a system where they're getting on the floodplain every year, sort of to your point, Carson, about dry years, or does that provide us some flexibility of just letting them have some bad years like they would naturally experience?
I think there's definitely bad years. For instance, this year is gonna be a bad year, but it's very on the extreme. I think getting the majority of years is kind of what we're shooting for, is that particularly the Chinook are not a tight cohort group. And so that having variability within that they're mixing cohorts gives us more flexibility in managing for those bad years. But if you can get the majority of the years, whatever that is, I'm not sure what the actual number is, but trying to do it as often as possible, not in years like this. Like this would be a tough year to have. Have we even reached a flow high enough to get over perceived not? Or
I don't think so.
That would be my point, is that.
Sorry, what was that?
You get them on the floodplain in everything but critically dry years.
Yeah.
And you're also working within the sort of engineering realities of, is the river going to be high enough to actually reach the notch every year? And it won't be, no matter how it's built. So.
How challenging is it to meet the different depth requirements of shorebirds versus waterfowl and fish? Because, for instance, you have shorebirds that require shallower depths than duck species. I'm just wondering how many conflicts you encounter with that.
I'll take that just because I talked to a lot of people who are familiar with shorebirds and different waterfowl species. I actually looked specifically at a group of species that was dabbling ducks, and then the shorebird groups of species that use the bypass, because I was told that those were the ones that were sort of most dependent on it in the time period that we're talking about for foraging habitat. But it doesn't seem to me like it would be all that difficult, one, because the timing of their use is very different, and the wildlife area is already managed for both species. So, dabbling ducks are at highest densities in February, and shorebirds, I think, start to go through their peak in March. Is that right, Robyn? Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the time these habitats are already managed for one species earlier in the winter, and then they get drawn down later to provide mudflat and other types of habitat for shorebirds. And there's actually another example that I think is true for between fish and birds, and I don't know if I have to actually test this with some biologists and ecologists, re-talk to the people I talked to before. But one of the other interesting things in terms of balancing between species is that dabbling ducks in February, when they go on to their flooded habitats to forage, they utilize those habitats really early on. You know, in the first 2 weeks, they're out there and they're getting the seed that they use as food. So, you know, dabbling ducks use both seed as food and invertebrates later. But they really hit those fields hard for 2 weeks or so, whereas fish, you know, Carson was talking about the big puzzle piece for fish is the fact that you have to have a primary, a productive food supply for them, and that food supply actually takes a couple of weeks to generate and to really get going. And so that's an area where I see reconciliation possible between species even. You know, you could have a habitat that's shallower for birds for a few weeks, and in the meantime, it's growing invertebrates, and then deepen it a little bit and create fish habitat in the same spot. So again, that's just something that comes out of me talking to people who are a lot smarter than I am about the actual ecology of these species. But I think there's a lot of examples like that where you could actually, if you had the ability to nuance, you know, manage the water with the gates and canals and all the structures that are already out there on the bypass because it is such an engineered system, you could do some really nuanced management like that that works for a lot of different species at once. So.
We've been doing a lot of work at the wildlife area on that specific issue, and most of the ponds at this point have multiple, these are the managed wetland ponds, have multiple depths. So they have a slough that goes through each one to help with the drainage, but it also, that, you know, the water could be up to maybe 2 feet or 18 inches deep. So I saw a pond today that all around the edges were dabbling ducks, and then the diving ducks were just going down the exact path of the slough in this particular pond. To me, that's where, you know, that's where the fish could hide from the predators. So I think that's something worth looking at. But in the real world situation, there's all these other variables. So, you know, we thought we have this down. Okay, there's shallow habitat when you first come into the wildlife area. Well, this year, the farmers outside of the bypass all planted garlic, which means that they've been irrigating all winter long. So now the South Davis drain that runs straight into the wildlife area is overwhelming the whole system. So now the ponds that that drain goes directly into are way too deep. So the bird watchers are complaining that we only have coots, and and the shorebird watchers, you know, it's too deep for the shorebirds, but they fully intended to have it, you know, and manage that. Pardon?
They found habitat elsewhere on the bypass?
Oh yeah, I mean, so you just need a large enough area that when one part of the system isn't working the way you want, and with such a large area, you can do that.
One last question here, Ken.
I'm not wrong, but I'm assuming that rice is not the most profitable crop for the private land farmers. And I'm wondering what type of incentives have been the most effective, or could be the most effective.
Yeah, rice is the most profitable crop. Tomatoes is also equally profitable, but it can only be grown in certain places. If you go about 1.5 miles south of Highway 80, the farmers won't plant any rice regardless of how low you lower the rent, because it just gets cold winds from the delta, and it's very risky to set seed. But yes, rice is first rate, but of course you can't grow rice the whole time. It has to be some sort of rotation usually.
Okay, so we'll wind it up here. I hope you'll all give them a nice round of applause.